Bombs burst on the flight deck of a mighty aircraft carrier. The explosions tear through the plane's tanks, spewing hundreds of gallons of gas that instantly ignite. Crew members scramble around to contain the fire. It's a desperate, heroic struggle, but it's a doomed attempt. Armed with handheld fire extinguishers and water hoses that only spread the fuel further, they run headlong into the inferno, never to be seen again. Some run away in vain, burning from head to toe. Others, pushed to the edge of the ship by encroaching flames, jump down 60 meters, 196 feet, into the water below. It's a hard impact, and some don't make it. As the inferno chews its way through the decks, dozens of sailors below are trapped, and always creeping ever closer as the smoke and the heat, but there's no way out. It all sounds like a scene from the carnage of World War II, doesn't it? Perhaps a snapshot from Leyte Gulf or Guadalcanal, as Allied warships harried the forces of the Japanese Empire back to its home islands. But this hellish picture we've just painted happened 2 decades later, in the late 1960s, off the coast of Vietnam. Now, the Vietnam War occupies a powerful place in the American psyche, a repository for all the trauma of war and a cautionary tale about the follies of foreign adventurism. But it isn't usually associated with large-scale clashes at sea. In fact, its best-known naval confrontation, the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, is famous for not actually happening at all, at least not like the authorities claimed. Decades later, US intelligence admitted that a North Vietnamese attack on the American Navy, the flashpoint that led to America sending its boys to fight and die in Vietnam's jungles and paddy fields, was simply a figment of their imagination. No, the tragedy we're talking about today, the biggest loss of life on any US warship since the Second World War, didn't even happen during a battle or any sort of enemy attack. It was a lethal and avoidable accident, and the lessons it taught would change how the Navy operated, saving the lives of many countless more sailors into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the true story of the terrifying inferno that engulfed the USS Forrestal. Forrestal was the first of its kind. Not just an aircraft carrier, she was something new. A supercarrier. 300 metres, nearly 950 feet long, with a beam stretching over 70 metres, or 238 feet wide, a displacement of nearly 60,000 tonnes of metal. Forrestal, by all measures, was the biggest warship afloat. When she was launched, back in 1954, she was the largest ship ever built in the United States. Navy brass had huge expectations to match. Forrestal and her class, they said, would assure US naval supremacy through the next 2 decades at least. Even before her keel was laid though, Forrestal was mired in controversy. There were still people opposed to the idea of making aircraft carriers the Navy's capital ships. They argued that aircraft carriers were too vulnerable to submarines and shore-based attacks in the missile age. Carrier proponents shot back with the vessel type's stellar performance during the war. Only 39 of the 226 carriers used on all sides were sunk. Just 4 of these were struck by shore-based aircraft, and all but 1 of those were from kamikaze planes. But still, not everyone in DC was convinced. Over at the legendary Newport News dry docks in Huntington, Virginia, Forrestal was 9 months behind schedule. During construction, her design was adjusted several times. The original telescoping bridge was replaced by a conventional island structure, and her flight deck was modified to include an angled landing deck and steam catapults. Forrestal was the first American aircraft carrier to be built with these innovations, but the costs of implementing them added up. Forrestal surpassed the World War II Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano as the largest carrier yet built, and was the first designed to support jet aircraft operations. In fact, the Forrestal's flight deck was so vast that the ocean liners Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary could be placed side by side on top of it, with room to spare. The height from her keel to the top of her foremast, meanwhile, was even taller than Niagara Falls. Miraculously, despite these continual last-minute revisions, the ship was eventually completed ahead of schedule and, very surprisingly, under budget. USS Forrestal was launched in December 1954. and she performed well in sea trials, hitting a flank speed sprint of 35 knots. The next year, in October, she was officially commissioned. Her motto, First in Defense, was a nod to her namesake, the first US Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. He had been a committed Navy man, so much so that he actually opposed the creation of an overarching Department of Defense, preferring to maintain a separate and autonomous Navy department. Despite his prestigious new appointment, though, he was always at odds with President Harry Truman, and the job also took a heavy toll on him. Forrestal was pressed to resign over his deteriorating mental condition, and he received treatment for depression at the National Naval Medical Center. There, he fell to his death from a 16th floor window. It was a sad end for a man who had given so much of himself to a navy he had loved. The warship that carried his name had been designed to honor him. Over her first decade at sea, the FID, as she was affectionately called by her men, became a symbol of American might in the Mediterranean. During the Suez Crisis, she was deployed to cow the invading British, French, and Israeli forces and press for an immediate resolution. The next year, she sped over to Lebanon, where a coup attempt in Jordan once again spiked regional tensions. But in the wake of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, US attack aircraft carriers in the South China Sea began sustained aerial operations against North Vietnam and communist forces in the south. USS Forrestal was the first of these based in the Atlantic to join in the effort. On July 25th, 1967, she arrived at Yankee Station, a fixed coordinate 145 kilometers, 90 miles off the Vietnamese coast. This is where US Navy aircraft carriers launched their missions. Roaring from Forrestal's decks were the Phantoms and Skyhawks of carrier Air Wing 17, a reactivated unit established the year prior purely for operations from Forrestal. It was made up of 10 squadrons, 2 fighter squadrons with F-4s, the Red Rippers and the B-Devlers, then 3 attack squadrons equipped with Skyhawks and A-6 Intruders, the Klansmen, Gladiators and Tigers, and a heavy attack squadron, the Vikings and KA-3B Sky Warriors. The support squadrons included a recon attack squadron in RA-5 Vigilantes, 2 early warning squadrons in E-2A Hawkeyes and EA-1F Sky Raiders, and finally a helicopter combat support squadron, the Fleet Angels and UH-2A Sea Sprites. For 4 days, CFW-17's aircraft plunged into North Vietnamese airspace in what was then the largest sustained aerial bombing campaign in the US Navy's history. It was 3 days into her deployment when Forrestal met the ammunition ship Diamond Head on the night of July 28th. Forrestal's officers faced a difficult decision. They'd just finished their first waves of strikes, and they needed to rearm before launching the second at dawn. But Forrestal's ordnance officers were very wary. Diamond Head carried loads of 1,000-pound, 450-kilogram AN M65A1 Fat Boy bombs. But many of these were at least 10 years old and had been sat, baking in the heat and humidity, in depots across the Pacific. Forrestal's men clocked the bombs' rusting shells, leaking paraffin and rotting packaging, but they had little choice. Worse still, the Fat Boy bombs used a Composition B filling, an explosive mixture sensitive to improper storage and age. The leaking paraffin stabilizing agent told the more experienced ammunition handlers that this load was extremely dangerous. But the tempo of Navy operations was going ahead with ferocious pace. Forrestal launched 150 sorties against targets in North Vietnam in the days she was at Yankee Station. They were dropping bombs more quickly than they could be resupplied, or even produced. When ordnance men reported the rusting, leaking bombs up the chain, and even suggested throwing them overboard as a matter of urgency, they were dismayed to learn that this load was all Diamond Head had to give them. It was either take these vintage explosives or cancel the second wave due to begin the following day. When the campaign had begun after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Navy had used the latest Mark 83 bombs. But these were rapidly running out. Now, after 3 years of war, they were forced to use surplus ordnance left over from the Korean War, or even earlier. Captain John Bailing was in a tough spot. He knew his men were right. The bombs were in no fit state to be stored aboard his ship. But the pace of operations must have put a huge strain on him and Forrestal's senior officers. He decided on a compromise. The bombs would be taken aboard, but stored only on the flight deck. That way, an accidental or spontaneous detonation would theoretically cause superficial damage, as opposed to a magazine detonation which could crack Forrestal in half and send her to the bottom in minutes. Little did he or the others know that the depot commander who'd overseen the bombs loading at Subic Bay in the Philippines had automatically assumed they were being loaded to be dumped at sea, and when he found out they were instead being loaded for active operations, he tried to cancel the transfer. But it was all in vain. The bombs were stacked in the temporary staging bay called the bomb farm on the flight deck. It was the first in a chain of events that would see more than 100 men killed. July 29th, 1967. Forrestal was preparing to send her second strike of the day. More than 20 aircraft crowded the ship's aft flight deck, while 20 more jostled for position. The planes were fully armed and fueled, and the pilots and the deck crews were making last-minute checks for an 1100 hours launch. One of the aircraft readying for launch was an F-4B Phantom II fighter, wings slung with Zuni unguided rockets. The Zunis, carried in pods of 4, had developed a reputation for electrical malfunctions and accidental firings. Harnesses connected the missile's electrical wiring to the rocket pod. These were known as pigtails, and they'd been usually connected only when the aircraft was attached to the catapult and poised to launch. Because the bombing campaign in Vietnam had become so intense, and ordnance officers had found that this slowed the launch rate, they began to deviate from standard procedure, connecting the pigtails earlier while the aircraft were in the pack on the flight deck. As Lieutenant Commander James Bangert switched his Phantom from externally supplied electrical power to the plane's internal power system, an electrical current surged through one of the 3 Zuni missile launchers on the port inboard wing station. And with its pigtail connected, the electrical spike had a route straight into the rocket. With its safety pin pulled, the Zuni was free to be fired, and it did. The rocket shot across the deck totally unexpectedly. It cleaved off a crewman's arm in the blink of an eye before striking and rupturing the external fuel tank of an A4E Skyhawk on the other side. The rocket didn't explode. Its safety arming mechanism prevented that, but its sheer force had punched a hole straight through the drop tank on the Skyhawk, and now 400 gallons of jet fuel gushed out, instantly igniting as it spread under other aircraft nearby. Shrapnel also punctured the fuel tank of a second A4 just aft, pouring yet more fuel onto the rapidly growing fire. Then, as crewmen were just getting an understanding of the chaos unfolding around them, one of those vintage 1,000-pound bombs under the A4's wings dropped into a pool of burning fuel, and it began to cook. Damage control teams sprang into action. They knew that, in theory, the Navy's new Mark 83 bombs could be directly exposed to a jet fuel fire for a full 10 minutes before detonating. But then, Chief Petty Officer Gerald Farrier of Repair Party 8 spotted one of those bombs glowing red in the flames. He charged into the dense, oily smoke towards the bomb with no protective equipment and just a handheld fire extinguisher, gambling that he could cool it down long enough to prevent its cooking off as he and his team brought the inferno under control. But what he didn't know was that this was not a Mark 83. It was one of those antique Korean War 60 series explosives taken on from Diamond Head just a few days earlier. All it took was a minute and a half for the fire to eat through the bomb's skin and ignite the unstable Comp B inside. Farrier, fire extinguisher in hand, was killed instantly, along with any of those helping him out or who just happened to be standing too close by. Then it happened again and again. After 2 more bombs went up, Farrier's entire firefighting team was wiped out. Worse still, heavy winds whipped the flames through the aircraft waiting to take off at the carrier's stern, exposing more explosives in a deadly chain reaction. Other crew members who weren't trained in firefighting tried to douse the flames with water and foam, but this only helped spread the fuel rather than put it out. Across the flight deck, it was a scene of carnage. Men scrambled around blindly, burning from head to toe. Firefighters, their clothes and bodies in flames, leapt into the sea. The inferno chewed through 6 of the 10 decks below the flight deck, the heat twisting and collapsing bulkheads, reducing tough steel alloys to rivulets of molten metal. About 50 men who had turned in after the night shift were killed by flash fires while they lay in their bunks. Water and extinguisher foam from the firefighting efforts above had flooded down bomb blasts into the passages. It was boiled by the searing white-hot plates of the ship, creating steam that blinded anyone attempting a rescue. Of the 134 people who would die in this fire, 91 of them weren't on the flight deck at all. The fire on the flight deck was put out within an hour, but Forrestal's voluminous hull continued to burn. In all, 7 of the 1,000-pound bombs exploded in the fire, hurling human bodies and debris as far as the ship's bow over 300 meters away. The flames continued to rage for 13 hours, fed by some 40,000 gallons of jet fuel that cascaded over the sides and the stern. Crewmen later said they thought their ship had been struck by a North Vietnamese MiG fighter. Captain Bailing thought there was a real possibility the ship would be lost. But thanks to the efforts of the carrier's crew and other ships that came to their aid, the fire was eventually controlled, and Forrestal was saved. One of the men on board was future Senator John McCain, who had just climbed into his A4 Skyhawk. But soon after closing the canopy, he heard and felt an explosion, and suddenly a pool of jet fuel splashed across the deck with a fire following it. He jumped down, rolled through the flames, and sprinted to safety. Then another bomb exploded, and he was thrown across the deck. McCain saw his comrades running the other way, headlong into the flames to help however they could. 2 machinists' mates, driven to the edge and cut off by the blaze, jumped 70 feet down into the water below, but then clambered aboard a rescue helicopter and dashed right back to the fire to keep up the fight. One wiry lieutenant heaved a fully armed, 250-pound bomb and threw it overboard with what was described as supernatural strength. The ship's barber disappeared while trying to hold a fire hose despite the acrid smoke billowing into his eyes. Doctors from other ships, including the Australian frigate Hobart, were brought aboard even as the fire continued to burn. The skippers of the destroyers Rupertus and Mackenzie manoeuvred their vessels to within a few meters of the Forrestal and aimed their fire hoses up and onto its towering deck, with burning planes teetering ominously above them. "I've never seen such acts of heroism," McCain would tell the New York Times. Captain Bailing agreed. He said, "I cannot in words express the gratitude I have for the performance of this crew." But for 26-year-old airman David de Romualdo, it was all as simple as being in the same boat together. Your life, he said, depends on him, his life depends on you, and everyone helped everyone. Small fires were still smouldering on the Forrestal as she limped her way back into Subic Bay under her own power 2 days later. Photographs show men peering at severe damage, holes blasted clean through the flight deck's 3-inch thick armor deck plating. The supercarrier now held the remains of 63 destroyed or damaged planes and the charred bodies of 129 sailors. The remains of some others who fell into the water still hadn't been recovered. Little was left of the state-of-the-art jet aircraft that had simply melted down and trickled into the sea. Exhausted rescue workers wearing oxygen breathing gear were still slogging into dark, flooded compartments to drag out the bodies of those trapped. More than 160 of Forrestal's men were badly wounded, blinded by stinging, toxic smoke, or horrifically burned. Emergency repairs got underway immediately, but the best these could do was to ensure the Forrestal a safe journey home. Fire damage stretched from the tip of the island's mainmast down to the port rudder, well below the waterline. After 10 days, the carrier departed for the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, where over a half year of costly repairs lay ahead. Getting Forrestal back in ship shape cost over $72 million. Total aircraft accounted for another $44.5 million. Another $10 million was spent repairing damaged planes. Ordnance lost was pegged at $1.95 million, and supplies and equipment destroyed were put at another $3.15. The cost in human lives, though, was of course far more devastating. This had been the worst loss of life on an American warship since World War II, and the Navy had to figure out what had caused it and how to prevent it from happening again. The investigation aboard Forrestal began as soon as it docked in the Philippines. Now, it continued for over 2 months, and in the end, Captain Bailing and his senior officers were absolved of full responsibility. The Advocate General's report states that poor and outdated doctrinal and technical documentation of ordnance and aircraft equipment and procedures, evident at all levels of command, was a contributing cause to the rocket firing. The firing rocket had sparked the whole blaze. Incredibly, the report found that 3 different mechanisms had failed to actually allow it to happen: the pylon electrical disconnect, a safety switch, and a shorting device. Although connecting the pigtails to the Zuni rockets deviated from instructions, as they were generally understood, the rules themselves didn't really specify what was supposed to happen. Crew were instructed to connect just before takeoff, but whether this meant at the catapult itself or while they were in the pack waiting to get there was vague and open to interpretation. The practice of plugging in the rocket launchers in the pack prior to being taxied to the catapults was, quote, not documented but well known and tacitly approved. The report made 3 full pages of recommended technical changes to the Zunis and their pods, and another 4 dedicated to handling procedure overhauls, but this was just the start of it. Firefighting readiness on board the ship was judged to have been adequate for standards at the time, but that the actual design and operation of the firefighting equipment on big carriers was totally inadequate for the task at hand, given the huge amounts of fuel and explosives gathered in such a confined space. Worse still, during the fire, the report said, various untrained individuals took well-meaning but ill-advised actions because they were unaware that damage control personnel were at the scene and were executing a plan of action. The amateur firefighting efforts had actually spread the flames by pumping water and foam, carrying oil and fuel inadvertently down into the carrier's crew spaces below the flight deck. But you can hardly blame them. The first and second bomb blasts had all but wiped out the main, trained firefighting team on scene. It truly was the worst-case scenario. Captain Bailing, though he was absolved from blame, had to bear some of the responsibility. He was transferred to staff work and never held a command again. North Vietnam, meanwhile, enjoyed a brief respite from the ferocious US bombing campaign. Only 6 missions were flown by carrier-based pilots over the country on the day after the disaster, down from an average 30 to 40. In the cruel calculus of war, the loss of life aboard the USS Forrestal may have spared the lives of people the bombs were meant for. In a more immediate way, though, the tragedy also undoubtedly saved the lives of other American sailors down the line. Onboard safety procedures were re-evaluated and improved upon. So, for example, Forrestal's own allotment of firefighting equipment was significantly increased. So the number of fire extinguishers was doubled, and the number of breathing apparatuses, oxygen canisters, was tripled. Old bombs, like the Korean War 60 series, were finally taken out of the munitions pipeline and disposed of, and newly manufactured ordnance was given a plastic-like coating to act as further insulation against fire. Crucially, bomb cook-off times also had to be clearly labelled, so crew members wouldn't meet the end as Chief Farrier had, who tried to cool the bomb first, thinking he had a 10-minute window before it blew. The Navy's official investigation also revealed that just half of the Forrestal's crew and none of its air wing had attended firefighting school. So, going forward, attendance at a naval emergency response facility became mandatory for all sailors. Fittingly, this facility was named the Farrier Firefighting School. But just 2 years later, another fire broke out on the aircraft carrier Enterprise, again caused by a Zuni rocket detonating under a plane wing, creating a fire that touched off more munitions. This blaze still, tragically, killed 28 men, but 96% of the Enterprise's crew had attended firefighting training, along with 86% of the carrier's air wing. Those flames were stopped before they could inflict the kind of damage and toll they had on the Forrestal. But fires, it would seem, proved to be a pattern for the Forrestal. Blazes also broke out on board in 1972, 77, 78 and beyond. It wasn't for nothing that supercarrier became known to darkly humorous sailors as the Firestall, the Forest Fire, or the USS Zippo. But after learning the bitter lessons of 1967, none of these incidents was nearly as deadly or destructive. After her repairs were complete, in fact, Forrestal went on to live a long and illustrious life. In 1974, the ship steamed over to Cyprus to evacuate hundreds of Americans after Turkey's invasion of the island. That year, the Forrestal crew also represented the US Navy at ceremonies in France to mark the 30th anniversary of the D-Day landings. During bicentennial festivities celebrating 2 centuries since the American Revolution, Forrestal even hosted the president. Gerald Ford stood atop the flight deck to review a 30-mile-long armada of magnificent tall ships and naval vessels from around the world as it streamed past the mighty supercarrier and into New York Harbor. A full 2 decades after she was launched, and despite all the ghosts that haunted her decks, the USS Forrestal was still clearly the pride of the mighty American Navy. Born from the earliest days of the Cold War arms race between the US and the Soviet Union, USS Forrestal lived long enough to see her own country emerge victorious from that historic confrontation, and she was finally decommissioned in 1993 and scrapped 2 decades later. USS Zippo, it would seem, had lived quite the charmed life for such an allegedly cursed vessel. Forrestal might be gone, but carrier Air Wing 17 still flies, nowadays operating from USS Nimitz, although most of the squadrons that were deployed to Vietnam aboard Forrestal that day have long since been disbanded. Of the main attack and fighter squadrons, only VFA 11, the Red Rippers, still fly, while VFA 106, the Gladiators, was re-established in the 1980s. The Red Rippers suffered badly that day. They lost 48 men, while the Gladiators lost 8. The Forrestal tragedy can't be divorced from its context, that of one country so relentlessly attacking another they were compelled to use dangerously outdated bombs and put their own boys' lives at risk. Many of the men who died that day lost their lives running towards the danger, helping their comrades and friends try to save their ship. It was a dark day, and it's a day that the Navy should remember, not just for the lives lost, but for the changes brought. Carrier work is dangerous work, but it doesn't need to be any more dangerous than it already is. Skirting the rules and not equipping your guys with the tools they need to help in a dire situation can truly mean the difference between life and death.